seminar. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Tomasso Agasisti from Politecnico di Milano. Have I said that right?
Yeah, that's fantastic.
He's got a huge track record in research into evaluating the performance of public sector institutions, and particularly education and higher education institutions, but I think more recently health services as well. But tonight he's going to talk to us about universities, and in particular about evaluating the efficiency of public universities in Italy. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. I am really honored to be here and have the opportunity to share with you this part of my research, which is inserted in a wider research effort in the field of evaluating the efficiency of public sector institutions, and especially about higher education institutions. I will tell you later why studying universities' efficiency is interesting per se, because universities are multi-product organizations, and so the idea of evaluating the performance in a multidimensional perspective is interesting from a methodological point of view. I will try to give you a sense of why it is particularly important to study the efficiency of universities in the specific case of Italy, and but I will try to derive some broad lessons about what we can learn about the efficiency of universities even in international perspective. So I will use the Italian case just as an example of what we can do through performance measurement using efficiency techniques, and which kind of policy and managerial implications we can derive from it. And so I will spend quite a few time to discuss how data that we have for measuring efficiency of universities is important. I will spend just a bit about the econometric specification of the model, and then I will try to devote the most part of the time discussing the results and to try to discuss what in this specific example is associated with higher or lower efficiency of Italian universities and why it is important on a policy ground. This is the main reason for which we are focusing a lot of attention to the efficiency of Italian universities. This is a graph that illustrates the dynamic of public funding to the higher education sector in Italy, starting from '94, and using index numbers. You can see the red one is the line about how it grew the funding for public universities until 2009, and the blue line is the public funding to private universities. What you can see, actually, you can't see, is that the public funding for public universities is much higher, of course, than devoted to private universities, but the tendency is quite similar. That is, at a certain point, there was a sharp decline in the amount of funding devoted to Italian public universities. It is not something that started, well, it started at the beginning of the financial crisis, but a decision about reducing the public support for Italian public universities dated before the starting of this financial crisis. So it is much more a structural idea of reforming the sector towards giving less money to the universities, but differently from the case of UK, the amount of money which is not provided by the state is not substituted by fees. You know, so the idea is not to exchange public funding with fees. The idea is that, true or false that it is, the universities were operating at an inefficient level, and so the idea is that the university can continue working by reducing the amount of money they have, because there is inefficiency in operations, so there is an incentive through this reduction of public support to operate more efficiently. And so the explicit political idea is that we can reduce the money because it is possible to achieve more with less money. So it is much more not on the reduction of public fund per se. It is a policy-oriented initiative. And what is important here is that the practical way the government started to do that is to define what we can call a standard cost for Italian public universities, something like we can define the efficient level of spending per student. And given the amount of money you have at a certain point, it is much higher than the standard cost. So you must act to reduce the amount of money you're spending towards that number that we can call standard cost. I will not enter into details about how the standard cost is calculated, but what is important is the policy idea. So we must give an incentive to university to reduce the money towards that number that the government is defining. In this paper, I will focus on the effects of these new policy trends on public institutions, even if you look at the fact that the sharp decline was in private universities. But given that the amount of money that is covered by public in private universities is lower, the strength of the incentive is likely to be much higher for public institutions than private ones. How can we measure, if the thesis is that universities are operating at an inefficient level, the problem immediately became to measure the efficiency of Italian public universities. How can we measure efficiency? There's a lot of academic work in the field, so the idea, just to be very synthetic on that, is that you can use statistic and econometric methods to calculate the efficiency of universities. You can use a parametric approach in which you define a specific production function or a cost function and then calculate and then estimate the coefficient associated with the production, or you can use a non-parametric approach in which you don't formulate an hypothesis about which is the relationship between inputs and outputs. In this paper, we use a parametric approach. So we try to estimate a production function of universities and try to see if it is true that some of them operate more efficiently than others, and to what extent we can find an efficiency in the field. There's a practical problem that I want to cite at the beginning, even if I will try to show which approach we used for solving the problem later on, but I want to clarify a methodological point which is crucial for this kind of analysis now, at the beginning. And the crucial point is when we observe the costs and output levels of universities and more generally of institutions, it can be the case that the differences that we observe are not related to inefficiency. That is, they are not able to make the most with the inputs that they have. It can be the case that actually some of these differences are legitimate because of different cost structures, of different production structures. And so it can be the case that these institutions are different because they are different. So they are heterogeneous in the way they operate, in the structural characteristics they have. And so it will be misleading to attribute part of these differences to inefficiency. Of course, the big problem is how to disentangle these two differences. So it is how can we separate this heterogeneity from efficiency or inefficiency. And so there is a lot of empirical work in this field. I just cited part of these words. One approach is to try to define broad categories, of universities that share some commonalities, and then say we do have 2, 3, 4, 5 types of different groups of universities. So we have classes of universities. And so there is some work that is trying to estimate this latent class model. So try to define, identifying those latent elements that define different classes of universities and then estimate different efficiency levels for groups of universities. The extreme way for doing that is to allow each university to have a specific cost or production structure. And so estimating production functions that have different coefficients for each university. This is the work that was introduced by CMS and Green, and it was applied by Grant and Gill first, and then in subsequent works. We also did something on Italian universities here. And it is estimating what we call the random parameter models. However, whatever is the model that we use to disentangle efficiency and heterogeneity, the problem is crucial. And it is crucial because if we attribute inefficiency to what is actually heterogeneity, we overestimate or underestimate, depending on the on the direction of this heterogeneity, elements, and we derive policy implications, saying that we have to solve inefficiency when instead it is normal difference between universities. So in this paper we apply a method developed by Wang Ho in a paper in 2010 to try to make this job, so departing from the Latin class model and running parameter models, and try to make a new method, for doing the same thing. So the method was developed in the econometric literature, and here we apply it to the case of Italian universities. This is the graphical illustration of what I'm saying, and I want you have clear ideas of what we do in this paper. So let us assume that you have a production function, very simple, with input here and outputs here, and each dot is a university, okay? So if you assume that all universities have the same cost structure, then, and you can estimate a production function here, this black line, and then you can calculate the distance from that function as inefficiency. But if we assume that actually we do have two groups of universities with a different cost structure, and so the blue universities have similar characteristics that are structurally different from those that are the black universities over there, then the true production function for the blue universities is this one. And so if I want to estimate the efficiency of this university, I do have to calculate this distance and not that distance, which is overestimating the inefficiency of that university. Okay, so here we apply a method for disentangle these two effects. Okay, these are the specific research questions that we investigate in this paper. So the first one is how the efficiency of Italian universities look like in a period which is between 2008 and 2011, after we take these unobserved heterogeneity into account. So the idea is to apply this model to those data, so 4 years of data of these Italian universities. The second research question is try to model the inefficiency once we estimate it. And so try to find out some factors which are associated with inefficiency. And especially in this paper, we focus our attention on the characteristics of the environment in which universities operate. So the research question is much more related to, is competition associated with computational level that universities experience associated with their level of inefficiency. And we try to model it, the variance in the inefficiency term. It is innovative in our view because, first of all, we will provide different production functions, so different functional forms to the production function to see how robust it is across the specification that we formulate. And the second point of innovation is that we start going into detail about how is the marketplace in which the universities operate. And this part is very important in our view because on a policy ground, if we can convince the reader that we are effectively separating the efficiency and unobserved heterogeneity, then we can look at the role of the marketplace exactly on the effect on inefficiency and not on something which is structurally different across universities. In all the efficiency work, a big part of the job is to select good variables and to try to describe in a quite good way the production function of the institution. In this case, we do know that universities can be, well, the university's production function can be modeled using as inputs measures of staff, so of people working, within the university, of students, and try to give, an idea of the quality of the students. Then later on I will say how we try to proxy the quality of the students. That can be, of course, very relevant to measure the efficiency, of the universities, because you have to take into account that educate students with different characteristics have different costs, and so different efficiency levels. On the output side, we want to look at the output of the teaching activity, and so looking at the graduates, and at the outputs of the research activity. And so looking at something like how much a university is publishing, how much a university is able to attract in terms of grants, how much a university is able to engage into activity of knowledge transfer. Of course, this theoretical depiction of how a university is operating is a bit constrained by the availability of data. So the final choice that we made is informed to this theoretical model, but it is a bit constrained by the data that we have at hand. And then I will tell you some details about the specific indicators that we put into the production function. Then, after we derived the efficiency indicators, what we looked are three broad categories of indicators. The first one is the wealth of the local market in which the university is operating. So it is to see if there is an association between being efficient or not, and how rich is the local territory in which we are operating. The second, and of course, please remember that I'm talking about correlating efficiency and wealth of the territory, so not performance. We do know that can be the case that universities tend to have better outputs if they operate in a more developed territory for several reasons. But here we are looking at efficiency, that is, the ability of transforming the available inputs into outputs. So it is much more on the process than the final result. The second point that we look at is a measure of market competition. For measuring market competition, we look at the portion of students that are enrolled in the single university as a portion of the students enrolled in universities in the same region. So the idea is something like a market share of the university in a given territory. And we use also the quadratic of this term to see if this effect is linear or not. And the third measure that we have is a measure of fees per students. Here the idea is to see if universities in Italy have autonomy in setting their own fees. And the idea is to check if those universities that are able to charge more fees are also more efficient or not. So the idea is to see if the money collected by students tend to be used in a more efficient way, Okay, so very fast here. The model that we estimated is an output distance function with the translog formulation. We use both the two versions of this translog expression functional form. One in which we allow for separability between outputs and inputs, and one in which instead we unrestrict this separability. And then also we did a robustness check with the Cobb-Douglas function, so to see if parameters change a lot or not. The answer is not, but we will see. Okay, these are exactly the indicators that we use in the paper. So on the input side, we do have the number of academic staff. This is a big choice because we didn't include the number of administrative staff in that. So we are assuming that the intensity of resources used in the production process is associated with the cost of academic staff. And so it can be the case that part of inefficiency stems from different numbers and salaries for non-academic staff. So we don't control for that. So the assumption is looking at the teaching process and research process. The second variable is the proportion, the percentage of freshmen who have a score higher than 9 out of 10 in the secondary school exam. So it is a stock measure of students enrolled into the university, but weighted by the grade they receive at the end of secondary school. So the idea is educating the students. Of course, we do have the number of students overall, so which is the measure of the stock of students that you have to educate. But the idea here is to have a proxy of which quality at the beginning of the university process have the students. And so the idea is the higher the number, the easier should be the process of transforming them into graduates. So if we assume that they distribute heavily across universities, the quality at the beginning is not an issue. But given that in Italy there is a very uneven distribution of these students, they tend to be much more in the north than in the south of Italy, then taking into account is relevant to describe how different tends to be the processes of education in universities across the country.
Tomasso,
Yep.
you're entering that as a linear, this is a linear model, so you've got those three explanatory variables as inputs?
Yes, but I do have a translog here.
Yeah, you've got. I appreciate your track. Well, you've got some of your variables then are level variables, and this one's a percentage variable.
Yeah.
So if you're looking at I'm just confused here about how if you look at a very very big institution.
Yeah.
And 90% of the students are good quality.
Yeah.
This model will tell you it will have the same effect on the number of graduates as if you've got a very small institution and the percentage of good quality is 90%, and I don't see that makes sense.
Yes, well, an alternative way to do that we did in the past, is to weight the number of students for these proportions.
So just multiplicative.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it is something that we want to do. Yeah, because in this case we lose a bit this size effect that you are mentioning, of course. Yes, that's true. The second, on the output side, we do have the number of graduates. In this case, it is weighted for the grade that they obtain. So in this case, we do have the number weighted by the score they obtain at the end of the university course. And then we have a measure of research grants attracted by university in each year. So it is a proxy for the ability of obtaining grants from competitive and non-competitive sources as a means for doing research. We don't have publication counts here, okay? Which is something that we want to try to extend, of course. So having a different proxy for what research is. And we don't have any measure of what we can call knowledge transfer activity or transmission activities. And then we have these three indicators that I have mentioned before about the ability of explaining the inefficiency. Okay, then we have the application of the Wang-Ho approach. The approach that they apply is to realize a within transformation of the data. So this is basically the approach that Wang and Ho are suggesting. So the idea is trying to remove the time invariant, individual effect that you have in the data, so that by means of this transformation, you can throw out from the data the unobserved heterogeneity. And so the remaining factors that you have can be evaluated as inefficiency. Of course, it is done panel by panel, so year by year. So within the same panel, you subtract the mean from there. So the idea is to, at the end, I don't have the time invariant heterogeneity across institution going into the efficiency estimate. Okay, just give a look at the data, at the results. And then I want to take some time to try to derive some policy implication from that. So the first thing that we can see is the parameters estimation. So here is the complete translog formulation. Here is the one in which I don't have the interactions there. And here is the simple Cobb-Douglas. What it comes out is that the coefficients that we have are not very different across the different specification. That's, for those who do our job, is a good news, because it means that the coefficient that we are estimating are not that sensible to the specific functional form that we are putting into the analysis. I want to move to discussing first the inefficiency effects. So let us here, what you have is on your, it is something like you have the estimation of the inefficiency, which is a distance from the frontier. And then here are the factors that are associated with inefficiency. Okay, so on the left side you have inefficiency, not efficiency. Okay, so it must be interpreted this way. What you can see here is that maybe I have a one in which I tried to summarize what emerged from that table. First of all, you have a result on the market, share of each university, which is very much U-shaped. So you have negative sign here and a positive sign for the quadratic term. So the idea is the increasing of market share is reducing inefficiency. So it can be the case that it is a signal that the university tries to attract more students by showing or by acting in a more efficient way, but the game is playing until a certain point over which there is a negative effect. And the negative effect on efficiency can be determined by the fact that once you're operating in a very concentrated market in which the most part of the share is in your hands, you don't have any more incentives to act in a more efficient way. Then we have the fees per student which are associated with efficiency, more efficiency. So more fees is reducing inefficiency. This is current with the potential story about the fact that when you rely more on the fees of the students, you tend to use this money in the most productive way you can, or at least it is something that is good to say to the students. And then the third is the positive association between the wealth of the local territory in which the universities operate and its efficiency. That's a very important story for the Italian case, and on a certain degree, it is crucial on a policy ground, because in Italy there are huge differences in the wealth of local territories, especially between the north and the south. And so if it is true that universities operate in a more efficient way in more economically developed territories, for instance, because there is more attention of the local community to the activity to the economic activity of the universities, and if it is true that they obtain better results, then there is a vicious circle, in which good performing universities tend to be more efficient, bad performing universities tend to be more inefficient, and then over time the gap is not narrowing but it is enlarging. Here is the efficiency scores divided by the 4 big areas in Italy. So in Italy usually we tend to separate northwestern area, northwestern, center, and south. And so what you can see is that the average scores, efficiency scores, imagine that the average scores range from 0, completely inefficient, to 1, completely efficient. What you see here is that the average efficiency is much higher in the northern part of Italy. So for the universities located in the north than the universities located in the south. What you see, and what is confirmed by the modeling inefficiency regression, is that efficiency is increasing over time, but still the gap persists, between the universities in the north and the south, because it is increasing all over the country. Just to give you an idea about the means, and not just, about the distributions, and not just the means, here we put all the northern universities together. Here is the distribution of the efficiency scores of the universities located in the south. And what you see here is actually that you do have not only the mean, which is much lower, but the problem is that in the south you also have universities that operate at a quite high level of efficiency, but you do have universities that do operate at a very low level of efficiency. So in one sense it's much more heterogeneous in the south than in the north, once we take and observe heterogeneity into consideration. And these are the trends that I showed here before about the trends, in the efficiency, average efficiency over time. So you can see that in the south, then there is an increase in the average efficiency score, even steeper in certain points, but still the gap is so high that you do have practically two very different situations in terms of average efficiency. What we did in the paper, especially if you want to derive some policy implications, is to calculate the correlation between the scores, efficiency scores that we obtain from different specifications, and what we find is quite high correlation, which is consistent with the fact that also the coefficients are estimated quite in the same way. This is important because, as we will see at the end, we make an argument to start thinking about using indicators of efficiency within policy activities. What we did then is to estimate stochastic frontier So without taking into account, this unobserved heterogeneity that the model allows us to consider, by putting geographical macro, dummies in the estimation of the frontier. So stochastic frontier analysis is something like we estimate the frontier of the universities without considering that they are different. And actually what comes out is that the efficiency that is estimated is much higher in the south. It is something like you don't see the differences in the process that it is happening there. So it is something like once you put the dummy of the macro area in the frontier, what happens is that a big part of what we can call unobserved heterogeneity goes into that dummy. And so once you take into account the structural differences between the south and the north, then the efficiency scores is not that big different. But what we want to do is actually to show up how different are they. And so not modeling like they are the same institutions, because if the differences in efficiency are so big, as we saw before, we must have a model that takes into account that show up these differences. Okay, policy implications and open issues. First, we did a lot of work in the field of efficiency of universities, but we still think that there is the necessity to put an emphasis on the accountability message, which is we are not looking here at graduation rates. We are not looking at publication counts. We are not looking at how many graduates in different fields you can do. We are looking at how you are transforming the inputs you have at the beginning, the quality of your students, the number of students, into graduates, into research grants. And so an efficiency perspective can allow us to depart from the discourse about the output, but move our attention to how the process is working. What are we really doing for transforming inputs into outputs? Here is, of course, heterogeneity and not accountability. So there is a message which is that there's a big role for observing this unobserved heterogeneity, so for taking into account, without which the real differences between universities tend to be lost. Now, in Italy, universities receive money depending on their number of students and on their research performance. So what happens is that some universities, like mine university, receive a lot of money from the public sector because it has very good graduation rates and very good publications. But the model does not take into account that, for instance, we are able to obtain applications for students which are quite good since the beginning. So we are rewarding for the application process, not for being able to graduate good students. So the idea is that if we couple the discourse about the standard cost, how much does educating a student cost, can be coupled with this discourse about the efficiency. And then we can try to introduce a different way of weighting the results over there. If we were in Italy, I would spend a much more part of my time in discussing about all this. I just want to give you a glance, my university is there, and the economic situation, here is a graph taken by economists. The economic situation of the area in which my university operates, as Joe and Gray knows very well, is very different in terms of occupational rate, money which is available, etc., to the universities that are operating there. And this gap means that in some way we have to discuss if it is reasonable to have same rules for different universities in such a different environment. Our university system is uniform, same rules for everyone. What happens? Quite simple. Students from here, those who have the money, go there. And what happens is that if they are good students, they remain there. And so they constitute the community which is able to push more pressure on the universities that perform better. I don't know any single students going from there to there. And this creates a perverse incentive. So I think that it is time for our country to start thinking about specific intervention for stimulating efficiency of southern universities by thinking about disruptive new things for those universities, but it is difficult to say. So I can say here in England. Then there is a role for the market conditions. Of course, I want to say that the market conditions themselves play a role here. We discussed today with Jill, in my city, which is Milan, 1 million people, 200,000 students over there, 7 universities in the same city, very diversified, a lot of competition over there. 12 universities in the region, 4 universities here, one couple of universities here, 1 university here. So there is, the competition do play a role, which is endogenous in one sense, because we do have 12 universities because it is Milan. But still, we're reflecting on the different policies that we can put in practice, that of stimulating competition between universities can become something that can play a role. And trying a way to attract students for doing the, way back is to try to provide an attractive option for them that actually does not exist. And competition can play a role in this respect. The other thing is about the fees. My university charges quite high fees, well, quite high for Italian standards fees. But it is able to do that because it is able to attract students. And actually the fees for them became a signal for quality. But for maintaining the signal for quality in a system where it is not true that all the universities have the same fee, actually it is very diversified. For maintaining the signal for quality, you must show that you are able to operate in an efficient way. So it creates a great stimulus to try to use this money for making the most. And then final point is about the sources of heterogeneity. What we didn't talk about in this paper is what is this unobserved heterogeneity about? We just employ the method to throw away this unobserved heterogeneity because we wanted to focus on efficiency scores. But there is a space to come back and say, okay, let's try to describe what is determining this heterogeneity between universities. Is it something that has to do with the substance mix? Is it something that has to do with the how much teaching or research or third mission or the balance between the three are doing? So we don't use a lot of information that we have here, which is the structural differences between universities, because we didn't care about that. But if we go back and look at that information, we can try to model how the different characteristics of the university are shaping their activity. And of course, in the future, what we want to do is to try to focus more on what we can call managerial efficiency. So how much those who set the strategy and the practical operations of the university are able to affect the efficiency. In my university, we do have a master degree, an executive master in higher education management, because we believe that there is a space to try to improve the efficiency by taking specific decisions. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Right, we have plenty of time for questions, so if anybody has a question. Caroline?
Yes.
Yes, I have a question. I've got a very specific question, but then there's a follow-up, much broader question. So there's the very specific question, first of all, when you measure market competition, are you looking just at the other public universities, or are you including private universities?
Well, the answer is we are looking at public universities, and the reason is that the fee structure tends to be quite differentiated between public and private universities. So if we look, for instance, at my region, here we do have something like 8 public universities and 4 private universities. In Milan, for instance, you can decide to apply to Politecnico if you want to attend a management school. You can go to Politecnico and the fee is around, say, 3,000 euro. This is the high level I mentioned, the above. Or you can choose Bocconi University, which is a private one that applies 10,000. So it is quite different. And I'm mentioning Politecnico is the high fee level university in the public sector. You know, so you can go, for instance, to Bergamo University, which is 1,000. You know, so the real competition effect that comes from Bocconi is not so. It is a subset of students that can choose going there. It is true that in few areas of the country there are private universities that probably compete for a different segment of students, but by competing for a different segment of students they are putting pressure on the existing market, at least at the marginal level, also to the public universities as well. So one thing that we can do is try to include. But the reason is that at this stage our impression is that it is quite a different market.
Okay. So you've already started to answer the broader follow-up question, which is that in the UK, the Green Paper came out a couple of weeks ago for higher education that sort of indicates that the government wants to increase competition and make it easier for new entrants to enter the market, and they might be private universities. So it's what can the UK learn from the Italian experience of having the private universities alongside the public universities?
Yeah, well, I can tell something that I learned from studying the UK case and then look at the way back. And the first time that the fees were, so I also can check if it is true or not, what I studied. But the first time I looked at the case when fees were made autonomous, you know, for universities, I was expecting to see quite different levels of fees, you know, from universities. If I understood correctly, it is not the case, you know. So what happened is that because fees are not only the mean for funding also, but also because it is a signal to the market, the level tend to be uniform. The Italian case is very different in this respect. So let us consider the different amount of fees, you know. So we are not playing at that level. We are not playing at 10,000 euro, you know. We are playing at 1,000 euro. But still, if everyone is playing at that level, competition is playing at that level, you know. What happened is that today fees are much more diversified in Italy. Once the ministry started to lowering the public money, universities tended to react in a very different way. And how the competition happened? It happened like universities tend to use fees to compete on different segments. So here, at this border, you do have a university which is setting very low fees, public university, so it can compete with the students who don't want to live in Milan, which is quite expensive, and who don't want to go to the big university in Piedmont, in Turin, for the same reason. So they use the instrument of fees for saying, you know, you can come here, it's quite, you know, cheap. And Politecnico is using the fee the way around, saying, you want to come to us, you must pay, because we are the best. You know, it is the institutional message I want to say today. And you know, so it is very differentiating. So how to foster competition is, in my view, in our case, it happened by allowing universities to have their own fee much more really free. You know, not give a uniform signal that everyone is charging 9,000 pounds.
Can I just add a rider to that and think, we often talk in this country as if our fees are uniform, they're not. Our fees for home EU full-time undergraduates are uniform. And actually what is often missed in policy debates and discussions about management of universities, actually there are markets which we've always operated in where we set our own fees.
Yeah.
overseas students, for example. So
Yeah.
you can spend, as an overseas student here, maybe just over £10,000, I know it's not low, on an MSc, and you can go and spend 30,000 at Oxford on an MSc. Within Oxford itself, you can spend a very small amount on certain type. So it varies by home EU versus overseas. It also varies by subject area considerably.
Yeah.
So actually, although we sometimes think, oh dear, if fee cap comes off, we won't know how to manage it. Actually, we've been managing it for years. It's just an important part of our market where we haven't had to make fee decisions in the same way. And likewise in part-time, we have part-time students in here most evenings.
Yeah.
We compete with other universities. We've chosen a market position for our part-time MBA where we think it represents value for money. So
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting that we actually are slightly schizoid on this. We think because of the green paper and policy, it's all about full-time students. And actually it isn't.
I want to follow up on this comment because I think this is something that actually, for an institutional characteristic that now I want to say, we miss in this paper. And we miss something which is the teaching activity which is beyond the undergraduate and graduate regular students. For instance, in Italy, every activity that has to do with MBAs, for instance, is outside the costs and numbers that we see here. You know? So that's absolutely true that one way in which the universities compete, even if you don't see here, is by providing different kinds of teaching activities, especially for executives and especially for high-level managerial subjects. The other way that we miss here in the numbers, but we catch in the phenomenon, is the degree of specialization of the universities. In the last year in Milan, a new university came out, so in the area which competition was already there. And it is a small medical school which is funded by a private hospital with a big reputation in doing innovative technological medical activities. And so the other universities in Milan that had the medical school, they still compete more just because a new player came into it. So something that we didn't check because the 4-year span is too small to look at, but the larger panels how to look at is how the dynamic of opening new